4 PSI. That's the tire pressure that changed drag racing forever. Not 40. Not 14. 4. The same pressure you'd find in a kid's beach ball sitting in a garage. And here's the wild part. This single, almost laughably simple number made one Florida racer virtually untouchable for 2 straight professional seasons. Picture this. It's 1983. You're standing at the starting line of an NHRA Pro Stock race. The air is so thick with nitro fumes you can practically taste the methanol. Your eyes are watering. Your chest is vibrating from engines revving 2 lanes over. Every single team in those pits, the million-dollar operations, the factory-backed programs, the guys with engineering degrees and wind tunnel data, every last one of them is running their rear tires at 8 to 10 psi. That's the sweet spot. That's gospel. That's what everyone knows. Everyone except Lee Shepherd. While other crews are double-checking gauges to make sure they haven't accidentally dropped below 6 psi, the so-called danger zone where tires catastrophically fail under load, Shepherd's crew is deliberately, methodically, intentionally bleeding air out of those rear tires. All the way down to 4. Other racers walking past his pit area are stopping in their tracks. They're nudging each other. They're shaking their heads. This guy either has a flat tire or he's lost his mind. Maybe both. This is Automotive Ancestry, and I spend way too much time thinking about the hidden turning points in motorsports history. Those moments where one person saw something differently and changed everything. If you're someone who loves the deep technical stories behind racing's greatest innovations, the stuff that never makes it into the highlight reels, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Because today we're talking about how one Florida mechanic discovered a physics loophole so elegant, so brutally counterintuitive, that it didn't just make him faster, it rewrote the rulebook for an entire sport. Lee Shepherd didn't have more money. He didn't have better parts. He didn't have secret technology smuggled in from NASA. He had 4 PSI and the absolute courage to use it when nobody else in the world would. And here's what most people don't realize. The reason it worked had almost nothing to do with tires at all. It had everything to do with how everyone else was thinking about the problem. To understand why Shepherd's discovery hit the sport like a freight train, we need to travel back to the early 1980s drag racing scene and really feel the context. Pro Stock in that era was the ultimate door slammer class. These were purpose-built race cars wearing the body shapes of production vehicles. Camaros, Mustangs, Aeros, but sharing essentially nothing mechanical with the cars you'd buy at a dealership. Under those hoods sat 500 cubic inch, naturally aspirated monsters pushing somewhere north of 800 horsepower through carburetors and mechanical fuel injection. No nitrous. No superchargers. Just raw, screaming American muscle pushed to the absolute bleeding edge of what was physically possible without forced induction. The competition was ferocious. Bob Glidden was dominating with his Ford Thunderbird, a man so mechanically gifted that other racers sometimes wondered if he was cheating simply because nobody should be that consistently good. Warren Johnson, the professor, they called him, was approaching racing with a scientific rigor that was decades ahead of its time, running data acquisition systems that most teams wouldn't adopt for another decade. Wally Booth, Butch Leal, Frank Iaconio, these were not weekend warriors showing up with their buddy's trailer. These were professional racing operations with million-dollar budgets, factory support, and full teams of engineers and chassis specialists. This was the pinnacle of professional drag racing. And yet, for all that money and talent and technology, everyone was stuck on the same fundamental problem, the 60-foot time. Look, if you know anything about drag racing, you already understand this. But if you're newer to this world, here's what makes the 60-foot number so critical. The first 60 feet of a quarter-mile run is where races are actually decided. A tenth of a second advantage at the 60-foot mark typically translates to roughly 3/10 of a second at the finish line. And in Pro Stock, where the entire field is covered by less than 0.2 of a second. That's the difference between a national championship and watching someone else hold the trophy. 60-foot times were everything. Every dollar, every engineering hour, every sleepless night on a test track. It all came back to those first 60 feet. The conventional wisdom on how to optimize those 60 feet was rock solid. Absolute bedrock. Run your rear tires at 8 to 10 psi. This gave you the optimal balance between contact patch size and sidewall stability. Drop below 6 psi and you were courting disaster. The sidewalls would flex so dramatically under the torque loads of a 500 cubic inch engine launching at 7,000 revolutions per minute that the tire could literally unseat from the rim. And if that happened at speed, you weren't just losing the race. You were potentially losing the car. Maybe more. Every crew chief in Pro Stock knew this. It wasn't discussed. It wasn't debated. It simply was. Enter Lee Shepherd. Shepherd was a Florida racer who'd started his motorsports career on motorcycles before making the transition to Pro Stock in the late 1970s. He wasn't from money. He didn't have Glidden's factory backing or Johnson's engineering credentials. What he had, and what turned out to be worth more than all of that, was an analytical mind completely unburdened by the weight of what everyone knew. Shepherd didn't dismiss conventional wisdom. He just didn't treat it as the end of the conversation. His revelation, like so many great discoveries in motorsports history, began with an accident. During a test session in early 1983 at Orlando Speed World, Shepherd's crew made a mistake. While preparing the car for a pass, they underinflated the rear tires. Instead of the planned 8 psi, they were sitting at 5. Most crew chiefs would have caught it immediately and corrected it before the car ever left the pit. Shepherd's crew didn't catch it until the car was already staged. And Shepherd, rather than pulling back around to fix it, made a decision that would echo through decades of motorsports history. He made the pass anyway. The car hooked harder than it had ever hooked. The 60-foot time dropped by nearly 1/10 of a second. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that's interesting, but maybe it was a fluke. A good piece of track, a favorable reaction time, a slight tailwind. Shepherd thought the same thing, which is exactly why he didn't immediately announce his discovery to the world. Instead, he went back to work. Methodical, systematic, scientific. If 5 psi was better than 8, what happened at 4? What about 3.5? Through weeks of careful testing, documenting every pass, every pressure increment, every 10th and 100th of a second, Shepherd mapped the performance curve of tire pressure in a way nobody had ever attempted before. And at 4 psi, he found something extraordinary. Not just better performance, a completely different performance envelope. The tires would squat down at launch, increasing the contact patch by an astounding 50%. 50. That's not a marginal improvement. That's a fundamental transformation in how the car interacted with the racing surface. This is where it gets really interesting because the physics of what was happening are actually beautiful once you understand them. When a drag slick launches, it doesn't simply roll forward. It wrinkles. The sidewall compresses, the tread literally folds against itself, and experienced racers call this tire shake. That visible oscillation you can see in the rear of a Pro Stock car in the first 30 feet of a run. This wrinkling, this controlled deformation, is what allows the tire to absorb the initial hit of power without breaking traction. Think of it like a shock absorber built into the rubber itself. The tire is managing energy, taking the violent spike of torque from the clutch engagement and distributing it across time and space rather than delivering it all at once directly to the track surface. At 8 psi, the tire has relatively high internal pressure resisting that deformation. It can only wrinkle so much before the air pressure inside pushes back and snaps the tire back to its original shape. This snap, this rebound, is what causes wheel spin and inconsistent launches. At 4 psi, the tire becomes something else entirely. It's compliant, forgiving, almost alive. It can absorb dramatically more energy, wrap more aggressively against the track surface, and maintain contact through a far wider range of motion. The contact patch isn't just bigger, it's shaped differently. Instead of the oval footprint of a properly inflated tire, the 4 PSI tire creates something close to a rectangle, with consistent pressure distribution across the entire tread width. Here's the analogy that makes this click for most people. Imagine the difference between slapping a fully inflated basketball against the pavement versus a partially deflated one. The basketball is rigid. It hits the surface, transfers minimal energy, and bounces straight back up. The partially deflated ball conforms to the surface on impact. It spreads out. It maintains contact longer. It puts more of itself in contact with the ground before rebounding. Now scale that up to a tire under 800 horsepower and 7,000 revolutions per minute, and you start to understand what Shepard had found. But here's what most people don't realize, and this is the part of the story that almost never gets told. Shepard's discovery only worked because of a recent and largely underappreciated technological development in tire manufacturing. The new generation of radial drag slicks coming out of Goodyear and M&H Racemaster in the early 1980s featured dramatically stronger bead construction than the bias-ply tires of the previous decade. The bead, the reinforced edge of the tire that locks against the wheel rim, on older bias-ply tires absolutely required higher internal pressure to stay properly seated. Drop below a certain threshold and the bead would break loose from the rim, and whatever happened next was going to be bad and expensive and potentially dangerous. The new radials could hold their bead at pressures that would have been catastrophic on bias-ply construction. But almost nobody had tested this lower boundary because almost nobody had reason to. The conventional wisdom had been built on older tire technology, and even as the tires themselves evolved, the assumptions around them stayed frozen in time. Shepard was the first person to seriously probe that lower boundary and document what he found there. He also discovered something else, something that transformed 4 PSI from an interesting experiment into a reliable competitive weapon. The ultra-low pressure strategy only reached its full potential when paired with bead lock. These are mechanical devices, essentially a secondary ring that physically clamps the tire bead to the wheel rim, independent of air pressure, that had just become legal in NHRA Pro Stock in 1982. Most teams at the time viewed them as unnecessary added weight, a solution looking for a problem. Shepard recognized them for exactly what they were, the mechanical foundation that made his entire strategy possible. With bead locks properly installed, he could run 4 PSI with zero risk of the tire unseating from the rim, even under the violent torque loads of a Pro Stock launch. The setup procedure his crew developed was meticulous to a degree that bordered on obsessive, and in the best possible way. Tires were mounted at normal pressure first, seating the beads properly against the rim. Bead locks were then installed and torqued to exactly 18 foot-pounds in a star pattern, ensuring perfectly even clamping force around the entire circumference. Only after this was complete would the team bleed the tires down to 4 PSI using a precision gauge calibrated to half a pound per square inch. This wasn't eyeballing it. This wasn't approximate. This was a repeatable, documented process with quality control checkpoints. In the pits, Shepard's tires looked almost flat. They sagged visibly. Other crews walking past his staging area would slow down, do a double take, sometimes stop completely. "That car's got a flat," they'd tell each other. Every single race weekend, the same reaction. Every single race weekend, Shepard would line up, launch, and leave them all wondering what just happened. The results at the 1983 Winter Nationals were staggering. Shepard's Camaro was consistently 2 to 3/100ths of a second quicker to the 60-foot mark than every other car in the field. Understand what that means in context. The entire Pro Stock field at a national event is typically covered by less than 0.2 of a second from the fastest car to the slowest. Shepard wasn't improving within that window. He was extending beyond it. He was creating a new category. He qualified number 1 and dominated eliminations, meeting Bob Glidden in the final and dispatching him with a 60-foot time that left Glidden's crew in a state of quiet, confused disbelief. They knew something had happened. They just didn't know what. Warren Johnson figured it out first, because of course he did. The professor had data acquisition equipment running on his car before it was fashionable, and when he pulled his numbers from the Winter Nationals, they told a clear story. Shepard's 60-foot advantage was too large, too consistent, too repeatable to be explained by reaction time variation or minor engine output differences. The advantage was at the contact patch. It had to be traction. Johnson began his own series of experiments almost immediately, methodically working down through tire pressures, and eventually confirming everything Shepard had discovered. But by the time Johnson had his program dialed in, Shepard had an entire season's worth of real-world optimization under his belt. A head start in motorsports, once established, is almost impossible to overcome in a single season. The 1983 championship run was relentless. Shepard took the Winter Nationals, the Gator Nationals, the Spring Nationals. His 60-foot times were so impossibly consistent that accusations of traction control started floating around. Ironic, because electronic traction control didn't even exist in Pro Stock yet. NHRA technical inspectors went over his car with the kind of thoroughness usually reserved for criminal investigations. They found exactly nothing wrong, because nothing was wrong. 4 PSI was completely, totally, unambiguously legal. You couldn't legislate against letting air out of tires. At least not yet. By midsummer, the secret had leaked enough that every top team was experimenting with lower pressures. But this is where Shepard's advantage became structural rather than merely technical. He hadn't just discovered that lower pressure was faster. He had built a complete system around it, a body of knowledge accumulated through hundreds of test passes across multiple tracks, multiple temperatures, multiple track conditions. He understood that optimal pressure was not a fixed number. It was a variable that responded to ambient temperature, track surface temperature, humidity, and altitude. He had charts, actual handwritten charts correlating all of these factors to ideal tire pressure in quarter PSI increment. Other teams could copy the number 4. They couldn't copy the year of understanding behind it. On a hot Florida afternoon, Shepard might run 4.5 psi to account for heat expansion inside the tire. On a cold October morning at an indoor facility in the Northeast, he could drop to 3.5 psi, knowing the denser, cooler air would behave differently in the tire carcass. While competing teams were still arguing about whether to try 5 psi or 6, Shepard was operating in a universe of precision they hadn't yet discovered existed. The cascade of secondary benefits kept revealing themselves the deeper he went. Lower tire pressure at launch meant softer, more progressive power delivery to the track surface. Softer power delivery meant less shock loading on drivetrain component. Less shock loading meant transmissions lasted longer, clutch packs wore more predictably, and rear-end gears stopped braking at the rate that had plagued Pro Stock teams for years. The maintenance costs dropped. The reliability improved. The irony was rich. A setup that looked dangerous from the outside was actually gentler on the mechanical components than the conventional high-pressure approach. And there was a driving dynamic benefit as well. High-pressure tire launches were violent, sometimes inducing the terrifying tire shake that could send a car off the track if it got bad enough. At 4 psi, launches became progressive, controllable. The car felt planted rather than explosive, and that made it dramatically easier to drive consistently, which, in elimination racing where you need to perform under pressure, is worth its weight in national championship. The 1984 Summer Nationals might be the single most vivid illustration of what Shepard had built. Track temperature was 95 degrees Fahrenheit. The surface was greasy. That combination of heat and rubber buildup and track oils coming up through the asphalt that makes drag strip officials nervous and drivers even more so. The entire field was struggling with inconsistent launches. Cars that had been rock solid all season were suddenly dancing around at the hit, and crew chiefs were scrambling to find solutions in real time. Shepard walked to his car, spoke quietly to his tire specialist, and watched as the rear pressure was dropped to 3.8 PSI, lower than he'd ever run in competition. His crew didn't say a word. They'd been here before, in testing. They trusted the process. First qualifying pass. 7:38 at 181.8 miles per hour. The field average was 7.55. Shepard had just put the equivalent of nearly 2 car lengths on the entire field in a single qualifying session, under track conditions that were actively punishing everyone else. Bob Glidden walked over to Shepard's pit area after the run. Stood there for a moment, looking at those saggy rear tires. Said absolutely nothing. Then turned around and walked back to his own pit. That silence said everything. He understood. And he understood that what Shepard had wasn't just a number, it was a philosophy. The 1984 final paired Shepard against Warren Johnson, who had by this point worked his way down to 4 PSI as well. This was the match everyone had been waiting for. The innovator against the analyst, the guy who discovered the advantage against the guy who reverse-engineered it. The race was decided at the hit. Shepard's 60-foot time, 0.912 seconds. Johnson's, 0.943 seconds. 31 thousandths of a second in the first 60 feet translated to a half-car advantage at the finish line. Margin of victory, 0.015 seconds. The gap Shepard gained in the first 60 feet was almost exactly the gap he held at the line. Johnson never had a moment in the run where he could make it back. That's how decisive the traction advantage was. And here's what most people don't realize about that win. Johnson was doing everything right. He had 4 PSI. He had beadlocks. He had the data. What he didn't have was Shepard's intuitive feel for the system, the accumulated thousands of passes of experience that told you 3.8 PSI felt different getting into the burnout box than it did 3 hours earlier, and that difference mattered. The tire companies were watching all of this with intense interest. Goodyear sent engineers to study Shepard's setup, and what they found surprised even them. At 4 PSI, their tires were operating in a performance regime they'd never specifically designed for, and the contact patch geometry was behaving in ways their models hadn't predicted. The footprint wasn't just larger, it was fundamentally different in shape and pressure distribution. This data went directly back into Goodyear's development program for the next generation of Pro Stock slick. M&H Racemaster went even further, creating a new compound specifically engineered to perform at ultra-low pressures. The challenge was thermal. At 4 PSI, the tire sidewall is flexing dramatically on every single revolution of the wheel, and this repeated flexing generates heat through internal friction. The same principle that makes a piece of wire hot when you bend it back and forth rapidly. Conventional compounds would overheat and go away under this stress. M&H developed a formulation that actually increased in grip as temperatures rose within the operating range generated by low-pressure flex. They took what had been a potential liability and engineered it into an advantage. Innovation breeding innovation. That's the Shepard story over and over again. The safety conversation around ultra-low pressure was real and ongoing. High-speed camera footage from inside the wheel wells showed something that made even experienced engineers do a double-take. At launch, the tire sidewall would actually fold under itself briefly. The tire was, for a fraction of a second, essentially turning inside out before snapping back to shape. The stress this placed on the sidewall cords was significant, and when failures occurred, they were dramatic. Rubber coming apart at speed doesn't just go flat. It disintegrates. Chunks of tire carcass moving at 150 miles per hour are a serious hazard to everything in the immediate vicinity. Shepard's team had addressed this directly. They installed Kevlar shielding inside the wheel wells of his Camaro, ballistic protection designed to contain debris from a catastrophic failure before it could reach critical components or, more importantly, reach the driver. This was safety engineering driven by the same systematic thinking that had produced the performance innovation. They weren't ignoring the risk. They were quantifying it and managing it. The tire monitoring protocol that Shepard's dedicated tire specialist ran was extraordinary for its era. He carried a single infrared temperature gun, a tool that most teams didn't own, and he would check the temperature distribution across the tire surface after every single pass. Inside edge, center, outside edge. These three numbers told a story about how the tire was loading during launch and whether the setup was truly optimized. He discovered early on that the inside edge of the rear tire ran significantly hotter than the outside, indicating uneven load distribution during launch. By making careful adjustments to rear suspension geometry and camber settings, he could even out this temperature signature, which not only improved performance consistency but dramatically extended tire life. Before Shepard's innovation, Pro Stock teams burned through enormous numbers of tires at every national event, searching for that one perfect set that would survive qualifying and go rounds. With properly optimized ultra-low pressure setup, Shepard could run the same set of tires through multiple qualifying sessions and into eliminations, saving thousands of dollars per event in tire costs and removing a major variable from the competitive equation. NHRA did attempt to legislate the situation in 1985, introducing a minimum tire pressure rule of 7 PSI. The rule lasted approximately one race weekend before teams began filling tires with helium rather than air, exploiting the fact that helium molecules are lighter than nitrogen and oxygen and therefore exert slightly less force at the same gauge reading. Whether the helium gambit actually provided measurable performance benefit was almost beside the point. The creativity of the response demonstrated that you simply couldn't put this particular genie back in the bottle. The rule was withdrawn, and ultra-low pressure became the established standard for Pro Stock setup. The irony is that the rule was never necessary to begin with. The data, when examined honestly, showed that 4 PSI was not more dangerous than 8 PSI. The failure rate of tires at ultra-low pressure, when properly executed with bead locks and the correct tire construction, was no higher than failures at conventional pressures. The perceived danger was rooted in the old conventional wisdom built on old tire technology. Shepard's systematic approach had demonstrated that the danger everyone feared was actually manageable, and the risk of continuing to run 8 PSI, in terms of leaving performance on the table, was the only risk that actually mattered competitively. The 1985 season was Shepard's masterpiece. He claimed the NHRA Winston Pro Stock Championship, edging Bob Glidden by 8 points in one of the closest title battles the class had ever seen. In a post-season press conference, Glidden, a man not given to generous statements about his competition, acknowledged directly that Shepard's tire pressure innovations had elevated the entire class. Pro Stock had dropped by nearly 0.2 of a second in average elapsed time across the board since 1983. 0.2. From tire pressure. From letting air out. In a sport where hundredths of seconds represent entire seasons of development work, the scale of that improvement was almost incomprehensible. Here's the thing about Lee Shepard that makes his story simultaneously triumphant and heartbreaking. He didn't live to see the full flowering of what he'd planted. In early 1985, he was killed in a testing accident at Ardmore Dragway in Georgia. He was 41 years old, at the absolute peak of his abilities, the reigning champion of the most technically demanding class in professional drag racing. The sport mourned genuinely and deeply, not just the loss of a fierce competitor, but the loss of a mind that had proven it could see things others couldn't. His legacy, however, was too deeply embedded in the sport's DNA to fade with him. Every Pro Stock crew chief who walked into a race weekend after 1985 was working from a foundation Shepard had built. The specific pressures evolved, modern Pro Stock cars, with their fuel-injected, computer-controlled, aerodynamically refined sophistication, sometimes run as low as 3.5 PSI with bead lock systems that would make Shepherd's 1983 setup look primitive by comparison. Tire compounds have been specifically engineered for ultra-low pressure operation. Carbon fiber bead lock rings have replaced heavy steel units, saving rotational weight while providing greater clamping precision. Real-time tire pressure monitoring systems now allow teams to track pressure changes during the run itself, compensating automatically for heat-induced pressure increases inside the carcass. The technological implementation has evolved enormously. But the physics Shepherd identified? Those haven't changed. Those are physics. They'll never change. The ripples from Shepherd's discovery spread well beyond pro stock and even beyond drag racing. NASCAR teams began exploring lower qualifying pressures to generate more mechanical grip on short track. Formula One, which had always been obsessive about tire management, began thinking differently about the relationship between pressure, contact patch geometry, and thermal performance. Rally teams in loose surface competition, where tire deformation has always been a known performance tool, started applying similar analytical rigor to their pressure strategies for tarmac stages. The questions Shepherd had asked, and the methodology he'd used to answer them, turned out to be universally applicable to any situation where a rubber tire met a road surface under load. The broader cultural impact within motorsports might be even more significant than the technical one. Before Shepherd, there was an implicit hierarchy in the sport's intellectual framework. Innovation came from the top, from the factory-backed teams with engineering departments, from the professor types with physics degrees and data acquisition rig. Independent operators with small budgets were expected to execute established best practices, not discover new ones. Shepherd shattered that assumption. He was the Florida racer with limited resources who found the thing that Glidden's engineers and Johnson's computers had all missed. He did it through observation, curiosity, and the simple courage to be wrong in public while he figured out whether he was right. That phrase, "pulling a Shepherd," entered the drag racing lexicon almost immediately and never really left. It means finding the elegant, simple solution hiding in plain sight while everyone else is building more complex, more expensive, more sophisticated approaches to the same problem. Think about what actually happened here. Not the statistics, not the championships, not the tenths of seconds. Think about the fundamental human story. A generation of the sport's best technical minds, working with the best equipment, motivated by fierce competitive pressure, overlooked something that turned out to be worth 0.2 of a second per run. They overlooked it not because they lacked intelligence or resources, but because they were too thoroughly educated in what everyone knew was true. The conventional wisdom functioned as a boundary that nobody questioned, because why would you question something that everyone already knows? Lee Shepherd questioned it because he was willing to be the guy in the pits with the Saga tires while everyone else shook their heads. Before Shepherd, 60-foot times in the 1.05-second range were considered strong. After 4 PSI became the standard, the class settled into a new normal in the 0.90 to 0.92 range. That's a 15% improvement in the most critical performance metric in drag racing, achieved without a single new engine component, without a weight reduction program, without aerodynamic development. Just a different relationship between a tire and a track surface, discovered by someone willing to take an unconventional idea seriously. The next time you watch a pro stock car leave the starting line, and I mean really watch, slow it down on video if you need to, look at those rear tires at the hit. Watch how they squat. Watch how the sidewalls compress and load against the track surface. Watch how the entire tire deforms and then recovers. What you're seeing is the living legacy of Lee Shepherd's willingness to let the air out. Every team that lines up in that class is running a direct descendant of the setup he built in that Florida test session in 1983 when his crew accidentally put in 5 PSI instead of 8 and he decided to make the pass anyway. Innovation in motorsports, like innovation everywhere, almost never looks revolutionary in the moment. It looks like a car with Saga tires. It looks like a crazy guy who doesn't know the rules. It looks like a mistake that someone decided to investigate rather than correct. The difference between the people who change sports and the people who merely compete in them often comes down to exactly that, the willingness to look at something everyone says is wrong and ask the question, but what if it isn't? That's Lee Shepard's real legacy. Not 4 PSI. The question behind 4 PSI. What's the unconventional solution you've seen work when conventional wisdom said it shouldn't? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story of drag racing's quiet revolution gave you something to think about, subscribe for more. There are hundreds of stories like this one buried in motorsports history, and we're going to dig up every last one of them.